So I'm old enough to remember when consoles felt completely isolated. You'd power it up, you'd get a flashing logo, and whatever came next was basically confined to the sometimes loudly spinning piece of plastic that was actually in the tray. And then the Dreamcast came along and Sega did some Sega shit. You know, a mixture of borderline magic and craziness. Sega shit, which made the hardware sitting underneath your television feel like there was somebody else there sitting with you. Now, if you weren't around at that time, or hell, if you weren't a gamer at that time, this sounds totally normal to you now. The Xbox and PlayStation basically are your roommates. You get system updates, chat, a whole gaming community in there. This was not the case in 99. In 99, that shit was deeply weird. Think about it. Sega jammed a 56K modem into a white box and told you to run a phone cord across your living room carpet. And if you don't know what a 56K modem is, I'll tell you what it's not. It's not a quiet connection. You have to sit there while the machine screamed dial-up noises at you while praying also that nobody picked up the kitchen phone. But for the lucky few that actually survived the handshake, you suddenly landed in a lobby with actual human beings. I mean, we all know how it ended. Sega got obliterated at the retail, but before they did, they managed to implant this weird, crazy feeling of actually dialing into a video game into our heads, you know, before their untimely demise. And failure or not, you gotta admit that before the Dreamcast, your console was pretty much completely oblivious to the outside world. Right, so let's set the stage a little. Before the Dreamcast, the physical walls of your bedroom or living room, that was your hard border. Think of it like an island of isolation. You were good as long as your friends were sitting right next to you, but when your mom said you couldn't have company, you were stranded on that island by yourself. Yeah, those were the days of clunky memory cards, notebook pages that were filled with level passwords. Rumors traveled by word of mouth, and everybody knew that one kid who swore that his cousin unlocked Sonic and Smash Brothers, and that cousin also conveniently lived out of state, you know, for legal reasons. Those were some good times. But the hardware was socially dead, technically. The cartridge knew that you left off at the water temple, but it had absolutely zero idea of who you were, you know, as a human being. But let me put on some armor for the comment section real quick, because I can already hear y'all typing. I know the Dreamcast technically was not the first attempt at this. X-Band was a thing, Saturn Netlink was a thing. The 90s had a bunch of weird cable plastic add-ons that were trying to solve this problem. But Sega changed the game, pun fully intended there, because they shipped the connection inside the box. You didn't have to go to Funko Land and buy some crazy adapter. The modem was a physical part of the machine, just sitting there waiting for your phone card to be plugged in. The hardware came with an actual door to the outside world. And Sega being Sega, of course, they built an entire ecosystem around a 56K dial-up connection. The Dreamcast dropped in North America on September 9th, 1999. 99. And can we just take a minute to appreciate how ridiculously clean that date was? I mean, that's basically just a layup for the marketing department. The launch itself was massive, which is crazy because the way people talk about this console today, it was like it was this beautiful doomed animal, but nope, it actually came out of the gate swinging. 372,000 units in the first 4 days, $97 million in 24 hours. Whoa. Those are some crazy numbers. A lot of that had to do with the hardware just feeling different than everything else that was on the market at the time. It had the arcade DNA baked in with the Sega Nomi boards. It had that weird little VMU sitting right in the middle of your controller, basically a Tamagotchi that Sega hired to be your memory card. If you don't know what a Tamagotchi is, look it up, because those used to be the shit back in the day. The craziest part, without a doubt though, was the modem. You have to remember that this thing showed up with a network plan back when most people literally heard the internet before they used it. That dial-up noise was jarring, yet soothing at the same time. I like to describe it as two fax machines having a very engaging interaction. if you know what I mean. The actual service setup though, that shit was messy as hell. I mean, Japan had Dream Passport, North America was stuck with like the Planet Web and those weird AT&T WorldNet CDs. Europe had Dream Arena. I mean, it was the late 90s and technically this was the future. It was just a future that required you to fill out some clunky registration forms with your plastic D-pad. But that shit actually worked. You could browse the web on your old TV. You can send emails if you had somebody to email. You could sit on the couch with that massive white Sega keyboard on your lap. Now, in hindsight, it sounds a little bit boring, but trust me, to a nerdy little computer geek back in the day, this was like the best thing in the world. But it got even better when they dropped software that, actually took advantage of the thing that they shipped with the console, because surfing painfully slow web pages on your TV is cool and all, but seeing another human being suddenly spawn into your RPG, that completely broke your brain. It was also the exact moment that the Dreamcast started to feel inhabited. Phantasy Star Online was like the OG for the whole Dreamcast era for me, which is kind of funny because if you explain the core loop of PSO, it sounds so basic. You roll a character, you drop down onto the surface, you hit things with a glowing stick. When the loot falls out, then you head back to base. But the loop was whatever. I mean, the real draw was the lobby itself. Once you logged in, there were actual people standing there with stupid names floating over their heads. Someone was always camping next to the item counter. You'd have somebody slowly poking out a typo-filled message on their very oversized plastic Sega keyboard. And somebody absolutely had a weapon that looked so much cooler than yours, which honestly, flexing is always going to be one of the main pillars of any MMO, but I digress. To get what made this so different, you have to understand that, when you're coming from a single player couch co-op being the only thing the console basically sits completely dead until you hit the start button. PSO felt like you were walking into a world that was already in progress, and when you left, the world continued without you, like the real world. You party up, you run a mission. It didn't need to render this massive, seamless continent of 10,000 players to feel alive. All it needed was a hub, some floating names, and a chat bubble that pops up whenever somebody F's up in a boss fight. And one of my absolute favorite details about this game is Yuji Naka, the guy who literally produced the thing, would just randomly log in and play from his house. A lot of the Sonic team devs did. You can tell them apart because the game actually gave them a blue chat bubble. And that right there is some real late 90s Sega energy. No massive corporate PR events, no seasonal battle passes with 7 fake currencies in a menu that reads like a rental car agreement, just a developer rocking a blue chat bubble and standing around in the digital world he helped build. Gaming. And it was pretty popular too. They had nearly 100,000 registered users in Japan alone, and by early 2001 it was pushing something like 250,000 worldwide, with somewhere like 26,000 people logged in during peak hours. Yeah, today a mobile game hits that in a closed alpha, but through a phone cord in your living room in 2001, that feels different. It felt like Sega actually pulled it off. It felt like the Dreamcast had people inside waiting for you, which is what makes the next part of the story really sucky, because you start to realize they gave us a bunch of DeLoreans into the future, but they forgot to build the roads. And where we were going, we definitely needed roads. Okay, so the best way to describe this entire setup is it was a brilliant, incredibly fragile, absolute pain in the ass. If you think about it, Sega was basically asking normal houses to treat their living rooms like a network server hub. And at the time when most families were still actively fighting over who got to use the phone. If your mom picked up the receiver, your game basically died instantly. But if you lived in Europe, the actual Sega service might have been free, but those local telecom rates, go ahead and stay online for one more run and see what happened when the bill comes. Shit, I'm starting to sound like my parents. And if you look at the timeline around SegaNet, it just makes everything that much weirder. The console launched in the US in the fall of '99. SegaNet didn't show up until a full year later. So if you're doing the math, you got these weird stack of browser CD-ROMs, random ISP deals, and then finally SegaNet rolled in with email, lobbies, and actual matchmaking. They basically made getting your Dreamcast online feel like pulling off a very complicated heist. And if you really look at the math, in early 2000s, maybe half the US even used home broadband. It was more of a wish than a norm. And here you have Sega trying to normalize multiplayer console lobbies while we're still screaming upstairs to hang up the damn phone. But that was Sega. I mean, they were constantly trying to live 3 years of whatever was considered normal at the time. Half the time it made them look brilliant. The other half is probably what bankrupted them. It's just that with the Dreamcast, both halves happen to happen in the exact same box. The whole timing for Phantasy Star Online was so funny to me because I still remember the game launching here in the States. It was like, end of January 2001. Like 2 days later, Sega was like, yep, we're killing the hardware and getting out of the console business. What? I mean, just think about that for a second. You finally get the one piece of content that totally validates your entire dial-up gaming community dreams, and not 48 hours later, the company tells you that dream is now officially dead.
Shutting the studio down.
Which is crazy because obviously they were right, or at least heading in the right direction. But I guess timing is everything, and seeing the future, unfortunately, still doesn't pay your manufacturing bills. So one of the things that really jumped out to me while researching this video and from my own experiences with the Dreamcast is that people can get completely unhinged when they talk about this console. A lot of them want to point to the Sega logo and claim that they invented the modern digital world. And all that sounds great on a thumbnail, but in reality, PC players were already about that deep online life. Plus, you had a couple of console add-ons trying to solve the dial-up problem for years. Sega didn't invent the concept of strangers connecting over a network. They just shoved it into the base hardware so you couldn't ignore it. They normalized the idea of your hardware actually signing in, the concept of matchmaking lobbies, the reality that some dude in Ohio you never met suddenly is a critical part of your Tuesday nights. Yeah, as usual, they were just way too early to the party. The rest of the industry did eventually show up. I mean, you got Xbox Live in 2002, Friends List became a standard feature, party chat happened. Hell, I would argue that the industry overcorrected. Today, if your PlayStation drops the Wi-Fi, it's basically an expensive brick. What Sega did was basically hand us a rough draft. I mean, Phantasy Star Online is your social ritual, Quake 3 Arena was your crazy serverless game, and they built a browser because of course you have to have a browser. You can't have the internet without a browser, even though loading Planet Web felt like operating a spreadsheet with a D-pad. And that rough draft did eventually turn into the online gaming culture that we have today. It went from this ambitious idea to just being the waters that we swim in. Consoles now track your digital library while the dashboard quietly shames you for unfinished things. Everything is permanently tethered to a server farm somewhere in Virginia. Now, I'm not going to do that thing where I pretend it's not convenient as hell, but a fundamental psychological shift did happen once the connection turned invisible. I mean, once matchmaking became an automatic background thing, lobbies stopped being this bizarre digital room that you actively travel to, and it morphed into, just being another piece of corporate UI. I think the recent demise of the Planet Web browser is like the perfect punctuation mark for this entire era. I mean, last year in 2005, the old browser finally went down for the 3 count. The compounding weight of the modern internet protocols plus the cryptographic standards just evolved beyond its ancient capacity. Or to put it more simply, it got old as hell and the internet simply aged the software out of existence. I guess the global networks have zero respect for our childhood nostalgia. And like I said at the beginning, we all know how it ended, right? Sega completely lost the console wars, the company bailed financially, and before they rolled off into the sunset, they handed us this aggressively messy duct tape iteration of internet connectivity. But for about 18 months there, they managed to turn the future into a physical location you could actually visit, which is one of the many reasons the Dreamcast retained such a bizarre emotional grip on people who owned one, me included. But if you know me, that's not a surprise. For some reason, when it came to consoles, I always went with the underdog for some reason. Something about a doomed corporate narrative and wildly experimental software, just spoke to me. But you have to admit, it's pretty crazy how accurately Sega predicted our current reality. The Dreamcast arrived before online multiplayer morphed into this invisible, mandatory corporate infrastructure. I mean, if you fired it up in 2000, it felt like discovering a secret room behind your drywall, and anybody who lived it, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The box just became a destination, which is why, it survives as like a physical postcard to the version of the future we actually arrived at. We just ended up decorating that future with much worse furniture.